A commonly requested addition to the unique item manual series for Diablo 2 has been the axes, which I have sadly put off a little bit because it is one of the more populated item types in the game with 28 official uniques, and that's before the weird, not quite an axe axes, only possible by crafting. I guess one could say the delay was because a case of axolotl. But god-awful puns about mispronunciations aside, we're starting at the bottom again, this time with an interesting axe used in many of the super low-level challenges, the Nasher. This level 5 axe is what you'll often see people using for things like low-level Ubers, but it is also just a good weapon for a number of early builds because despite its lowish damage, it packs crushing blow and open wounds in decent amounts, which gives you a serious edge against bigger enemies like act bosses, which are generally the major threat in normal difficulty. Sadly, the next axe doesn't quite have the same amount of gimmicky utility, but it is still a decent weapon, and that is Death Spade, a better all-round weapon for whenever you can use it. Packing an attack rating boost, blind target, and mana per kill, it makes it a fairly solid early Zeal weapon for general use, and I have used it several times early on in solo self-found if it drops, though it doesn't scale very well, so you'll find yourself ditching it by late normal, or if you're really unlucky, early nightmare. Next down the list is the even more generic Blade Bone, a bit faster than the Death Spade at the cost of a little average damage. It's still a fairly decent early weapon that falls into the same category as Death Spade in that it is good enough early use, but it won't last you into Nightmare and it isn't really something worth upgrading for use later. After that we have Skull Splitter, which I really like the updated graphics for in Diablo 2 Resurrected. It makes it look a lot more appealing than the tiny hatchet we had in Lord of Destruction. Though like most normal one-handed axes, we've got a weapon you generally won't use outside of normal, and while a little more upgradable than the last two axes, it's still not worth burning the runes when you could just make a better rune word in Nightmare. With open wounds, blind target, and good speed, it's not the worst weapon, but it is getting close to that level cutoff. Last in the normal one-handers is Rakescar. It keeps the speed of the other fast normal axes, but does bring in about double the damage. Overall, a decent weapon to tide you over in late normal or even early Nightmare, and while it can't directly compete with some rune word options, it's a decent enough axe, and is actually an okay upgrade to exceptional thanks to the decent enhanced damage percent effect, and well, the speed, though I wouldn't bother taking it to elite. In the normal two-handed axe space, we start with the Axe of Fekmar, a rather fun low-level two-hander, which works fairly well early on when you don't really need a shield for durability purposes. It does okay damage for a level 8 weapon and packs in cold resist and target freezing, which can make it a pretty nice early on weapon, though it does quickly fall off on damage when we get into later normal, as many low-level items tend to do. Upping our damage a bit, we move on to Gore Shovel, packing, as we said, a bit more damage and a bit faster attack speed, not to mention open wounds and a fairly significant strength bump for the level, which will give you a little bit more damage. Overall, for me at least, I just treat it as a Malice competitor, though being two-handed axe does hurt it a bit there. Though if you want to get into weapons that actually make up for the lack of a shield with more than just damage, we have the Chieftain, a little slower than Gore Shovel, but a lot better enhanced damage, and it stacks on that with resists, lightning damage, and even mana per kill that can generally last you into early Nightmare, unless you find a better one-handed option to pair with something like a Rhyme, and it's pretty fun for a number of two-handed favoring builds regardless. On a little more elementally turned twist, we have Brain Hue, which lacks a little bit of physical damage compared to the Chieftain, but makes up for it with a big chunk of fire damage for the level, though it does lack resist and such. It does have a decent chunk of mana leech and bonus mana for more resource-intensive melee builds, though. So yeah, those may be fewer and further between, but it is there. Basically, it's a good axe, but there are better options than normal. That brings us to the last of the normal axes, Humongous. Quite a bit slower than all the other axe options we've looked at so far, but also significantly more damage per hit, and sneaking a bit of crushing blow in there to help in that regard as well. Honestly, if it wasn't so slow, it would be a fairly high pick, but that speed penalty generally keeps it on the sidelines for most builds, especially while leveling, since it's usually better to swing faster rather than just harder. As we move into the exceptionals, we start getting a few more useful tools, as our damage and speed really picks up, even at the low end with Cold Kill, packing okay damage for early Nightmare, as well as being obviously cold themed with a chance to cast abilities, base cold damage, cold resist, and even okay enhanced damage. It's not going to really take you into hell difficulty, but it will do plenty of work in Nightmare when you find it. After that, we have Butcher's Pupil, an extremely useful axe for the mid-game. Heck, it can even be useful through the end of hell, mainly thanks to the solid one-handed damage, good speed, indestructibility, not to mention the deadly strike and open wounds, all at reasonable level requirements for its power and even stat requirements, and to this day, it's one of my favorite mid-game Zeal weapons. It's just solid and reliable. Next, we have the Confused Fused Druid Axe, Isle Strike, which isn't a bad weapon and may be a bit more usable in 2.4 due to the changes to Druid attack speeds, though in 2.3 or Lord of Destruction it always just felt too slow on the Druid. Thankfully in 2.4, as mentioned, we're breaking away from weapon-based attack speed on Druids and allowing all equipment to do it, basically letting you bring the Crushing Blow plus skills and okay damage to bear on this weapon, though I need to retest it to really see if it can outperform the other weapons you'll find at this tier, since it's definitely on the edge of whether it's going to be really good or just kind of disappointing. Less on the edge is Pompey's Wrath. Some people like it, and it does have some okay mods with chunky bit of fire damage, Volcano on striking, slow target, and mediocre damage, but decent speed. The big problem I have with it, and you've probably already guessed, knockback. If it had something to make it more useful versus bosses specifically, maybe it would have a use, but frankly, this one is just one of a few exceptional axes I just give a hard pass on unless I'm running something very weird that doesn't get bothered by the knockback. Back in the realm of doing some okay damage is Guardian Naga. It's not amazing compared to some of the previous stuff, but it's also not bad, with decent damage, a bit of poison, and even a chance of casting Poison Nova if you like that. It does okay for a cheap, exceptional axe, and I've used it a few times on solo self-found runs, but never really bothered to equip it on my endgame builds. Onto the two-handers, we have Warlord's Trust, which if you're going to use it, you'll want to grab an ethereal one if possible, since it's auto-repair, but without being ethereal, its damage just can't justify the two-handed nature of it, even with resist, defense, and vitality bumps. That said, our next one is actually often overlooked, and that's Spell Steal. Basically a fancy teleport staff for most people, but it can do okay damage even if it's a bit slow. By packing the charge's heavily reduced requirements and extra mana and mana regen, it actually can be a decent substitute for some other things, though it does have significantly less charges of teleport than a standard teleport staff, much less something like Naj's Puzzler. Though it does actually also pack Decrepify, which can be useful and is a bit more unique to this specific weapon. Another axe that suffers from kind of bad attack speed on what would otherwise be a good weapon is Storm Rider, and as you can tell by the name, it's all about that lightning damage with plenty of chance to cast, added lightning damage, retaliatory lightning damage, and actually not terrible per hit physical damage. The problem though is that the speed is bad for most popular main attacks, though it can be okay with some niche builds for a mid-game weapon. I generally don't use this very often. Though to make up for that, we have Boneslayer Blade, which while just okay in 2.3, I have a feeling at least someone, even if it's just me, is going to make a gimmick build for this in 2.4. Though, unfortunately, due to that Holy Bolt being when struck rather than on striking, it's only going to be so useful and it's going to be a very niche side weird-ass build. That said, it is a fast axe with good damage and a fairly decent punch to undead, just in general. It's definitely a decent mid-game unique to find and use regardless, though there are better weapons in the long run. The last of the exceptional axes is another slow boy, the Minotaur, packing Crushing Blow, slow target, blinding, and a few other nice mods, not to mention actually pretty solid damage. For a build that can get away with slower attacks, it's pretty decent, though like most other slow weapons, these are niche builds rather than meta builds, so you'll only rarely see people using this in the wild for good reason. Last up, we have the Elites, which actually pack a few fun alternatives to the other popular weapons, starting with the overlooked Razor's Edge. It packs decent damage, good percents of deadly strike and open wounds, and even defensive piercing, along with decent swing speed. This is a solid weapon for general use. It's not going to beat out weapons like Grief by any means, but until you get to the post game, it can easily take you through the end of hell. After that is Rune Master, which can spawn naturally with 3 to 5 sockets, with generally only 5 socket ones being used for any real build options, and even then usually only ethereal ones being used for like main kind of weapons, which is really uncommon but strong for the specific use case. The reason this axe is so fun though, even outside of that, is that it's really flexible to your needs, and by packing Cannot Be Frozen and okay damage on top of its base, it is a solid base that isn't really easily replicated through any other means. If you're looking for more speed though, our next axe is Cranebeak, with really nice attack speed, okay damage, defense piercing, lightning damage, and a bit of magic find to boot. It's never really best in slot, but it can do decent work for builds going through hell that just want some pocket magic find and decent damage without sacrificing speed for something like Alibaba. I rarely ever use this axe, but I do like the look of it and can see some mid-game uses for it personally. The last of the elite one-handers is Death Cleaver, also fast with a bit better damage and packing on top of that deadly strike to double that damage. This weapon is often overlooked due to how uncommon it is, and that Grief is just, well, better, but as a general use weapon, it's still fairly solid, especially since it does a decent bit more damage than you'd guess at first glance thanks to that deadly strike. Moving to the two-handers, we have Ethereal Edge, a decent enough axe, mainly because it's always ethereal and has some okay damage perks. It's just not fast enough for most builds that would use it, and you can generally get better weapons for most of your two-hander builds by the point you start being able to even use this. Basically, it's pretty solid if you haven't found better, but there are a lot of better options that you can kind of pick from. After that, we have Hellslayer, a weapon that becomes stronger the higher level you are, but due to its slow speed, is stuck in certain niche builds for usefulness, like several of the other big hitting two-handers. Packing crazy boost to maximum damage as well as per level boost to strength and vitality, it's pretty much its claim to fame, along with a pinch of extra fire damage. I generally end up preferring something faster though. You know, something like Messerschmitt's Reaver, which will usually end up with similar average damage, but has much better base speed, has a solid attack rating boost, and a bump to all attributes. This actually used to be one of the more popular axes back in the old days, but it quickly fell off with unique update passes and rune words and stuff like that and skill changes, and it's never quite come back to the meta, so I may just be biased to like it for nostalgia's sake, and it kind of looks cool, though I do wish the axe head was a little bit bigger. And the last of the official axes is Executioner's Justice, which would be nice if that Decrepify was on striking rather than kill, but that aside, it's still a fairly decent axe with solid damage, crushing blow, and defense piercing, and the attack speed boost helps overcome a bit of the notorious Glorious Axe slowness. Now, you may have noticed there's more axes here, and that's because there's a few unofficial axes you can get by upgrading quest items, such as Malice, Hellforge Hammer, and Staff of Kings, among others, which can result in some weird, unexpected weapons, even stuff like this Horadric Staff Tomahawk. Though yeah, none of them are broken, just fun and weird, and you get them through crafting and upgrading stuff that you normally wouldn't. And as always, if you enjoyed this or found it useful, a like helps out a ton, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye.